I think the next two folks we're going to talk to here are two of the smartest people that I know in general and have discussions about this stuff on a regular basis with. Lewis, who is the Director of Creative Solutions here at Media.Monks, as well as Rachel Noonan, whose official title is Director at Jam3, Director of Strategy at Jam3, but she's really a futurist, which is a whole nother crazy conversation that makes you feel not very smart. So I'm going to pass the microphone to you guys and let you get started on this. And super excited that you both are spending some time with us sharing your knowledge about what this means.
Thanks so much, Joe. We've got 35 minutes, so we're going to hit it off real quick because there is a lot to talk about and build off all the chatter that our last panelists were talking about. I myself am really passionate about this space, everything ranging from, the ethics of interactivity to designing true value in the experience. And I know my partner in crime here also has just like a deep and broad perspective and knowledge base, which I want to tap into a little bit. We want to talk about some specific things to really add value to the conversations happening. One is we're going to talk about like how actually we've gotten here, why we're here right now, this time, this place, in terms of the, the technology and the innovation that's gotten us here, the value to consumers and to the industry at large. We're going to talk about skilling up. So for you brand warriors out there, how do you make things feasible to actually build in this world and support your team as the growth happens? And then what you can do next in the here and now as the metaverse, the many metaverses continue to grow. So first and foremost, Lewis, I wanted to throw to you to chat a little bit about why now? So, we're approaching 2022. The pandemic has obviously accelerated technological innovation in some pretty significant ways, but why are we having this conversation now and not 2 years previous or 3 years from now? I wanted to get your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, again, without going too heavily into polymetallic materials or going heavily into microscopic level copper soldering, we're at a place that's a really fascinating, unique place where, because of, sorry, just charging my computer, when the pandemic started, we were at a gradual pace towards virtualization and towards the next real, to be honest, phase in our economies. Klaus Schwab talks a lot about the fourth industrial revolution, and really we were plodding towards that. But with the pandemic hitting and everybody shifting away from city centers and the focus shifting away from traditional work and the value of traditional work, digital economies and virtualized economies sprang up immediately. You look at, just for example, so I just moved out of New York City to get closer to the metaverse. I care more at this point about my proximity to data centers and to companies that are leaning into the metaverse. So I actually just moved to Raleigh, North Carolina, where Epic, Lenovo, and IBM and a couple other compute companies are based. But as that massive shift occurred, while we have problems with the supply chain in our physical economy, we don't have problems in our virtual economy. And so you look at this place where Moore's law has plateaued, and we're starting to get out of that as chipset manufacturers and semiconductor manufacturers determine new ways to solder and to get our chips smaller and smaller. But at the same time, we're at this cultural crux where you look at traditional media and you look at traditional types of consumption and virtualized forms of consumption, and the last panel talked a lot about games, are bigger and more normalized than anything else. You look at some of the events that have occurred in Fortnite in the last year, and without sounding too sacrilegious, those events which a person attends and they hold a controller, so they are present, they are engaging, they are piloting in that space. If you added up the number of people that attended to that and found a real world parallel, you would be looking at massive religious pilgrimages in terms of the physical scale. So the number of people that are engaging is massively changing, and you're getting a demographic shift where video game behavior and gaming is completely normalized. It's the sort of thing where I don't really remember a time where I didn't have interactions with video games. Some of my earliest memories are actually playing video games as a 4-year-old. And so that shift where things are normalized, and we have to think about technology as in a technology doesn't actually ever matter until it feels inevitable, until it feels natural. It's a great piece I saw recently as a last note on this, where a baby looks at a magazine today as a broken iPad. And that, without sounding too prosaic, is really meaningful, meaning that the expectation of interactivity and virtualization and engagement is set at birth now, or nearly at birth, as opposed to other forms of engagement where we look at our world differently is the base tier level. So you have this, this sort of influx of compute getting bigger, and then getting to a place where, quite frankly, the way we think and perceive is changing. The last note on that I'll say is I read a study a couple of days ago, I think it was out of UCSD, where they were looking at the persistence of vision, which is the point at which if you have a black card and a gray card and you spin it on a string, it's how cinema works. So that where it turns gray and where you're unable to perceive distinct frames. They've done recent studies on that, and the hertz, so the way at which people view, which is a hertz, for younger generations, so this is like 6 to 12 right now, is hitting somewhere in the range of upwards of 200 hertz, while people who are my age or older are looking at like much less, like 90 to 120. So that's the transformative shift. That's why this is occurring now.
Well, and it's, there's a few things. One is, I mean, and we would discuss this, like we could have a whole technology talk, which I would love to at a later date for sure. But the beautiful insight there and what you've articulated is really consumer need and drive, right? So you've got mass adoption, you've got scale, and with it, the technological systems have actually started to line up. And the delineation or distinction between, say, your Fortnite or, tons of the massive global gaming communities. I mean, esports has trumped other sporting franchises around the world over the years to some pretty significant numbers. The interoperability or the connectivity between systems and that word presence, which the Facebook team has really, really leaned on in a significant way, trying to actually, to your point, almost meld the senses across platforms. So whether, I could have and should have you in AR in my room right now, and we could be having this conversation, and you could be putting, tactile items on your hand so that we could actually feel through the haptic feedback. Those pieces to the puzzle really seem to exemplify where we're going in terms of, what could be. Could you talk a little bit about where we are now, because there's so much hype, and which is good, especially if you're a brand looking for novelty or you're looking for interesting, fun promotions, which also moves the technology and the platforms forward. But could you expand a little bit on how you feel brands can do something meaningfully now? And I'll caveat this with, let's use the word authentically as a sidebar. It's just a precursor. Everybody knows it needs to be legit and authentic, right? Like this is like a heavily educated crew of peeps. Is there a way for us to help them imagine how they can do something interesting, like right now, right here with the technology?
I mean, there's a very simplistic answer, and then I'll give a much better answer. The simplistic answer is stop making stuff that sucks, and stop making stuff that people don't want to engage in, and make stuff that people want to engage. I'll give a great example. So we worked with Ally Bank, who are a bank, and they said, we want to do a metaverse thing. We want to do something in gaming. And they pitched us some ideas, and it was cool. And at the time, I had been playing fairly addictively a debt simulator. It's called Animal Crossing. Those of you may have heard of it last year, where basically you go to this tropical island and this horrible raccoon puts you in debt as you build this island that you thought you were on vacation, but now you're in debt for days and days and days. And there's an actual stock market within and all this sort of stuff. And I said, hey, you're a bank. Why don't you come and give banking advice and act like a bank in Animal Crossing? Because instead of just being like, yo, I put a logo on the island, which is like cool. So like they actually provided a utility and exerted themselves as their existing brand within that space. And so when you create authenticity, look at utility, look at the ability to provide how you bring to the community, and also look at like, hey, is this something cool to engage? Don't just be a mayonnaise jar rolling around in Fortnite. Be something that is engaging, that is fascinating, and helps players power up or create a different way of looking at things.
Mm-hmm.
I think something that somebody said a lot earlier. So I mentioned one of my, I'll say two things on this. So one of my favorite early memories, there is a Doom mod that the cereal brand Chex came out with. It's called Chex Quest. And it is a spectacular game. It is an excellent game. And this was a brand who were like, this is like early 90s. We're going to do a video game thing. Let's make a Doom mod that's based on Chex. Weird idea. Absolutely rad. Absolutely amazing. I have memories because I couldn't play Doom because I was too young to play Doom, according to my parents. But I have huge memories of playing Chex Quest. And that provided a space and that provided utility. And that was cool. I think the thing that somebody touched on in the last thing is for people where this is native and engaging and is a part of their day to day, it is real. It does create memories and it does create meaning. One of my favorite memories, so I've been in small spaces for the past 2 years and not able to meet people in person. One of my favorite memories is actually I started taking meetings very early on in the pandemic. I got really bored with video calls really early on and said, hey, I play video games. My clients are video game companies. Why don't we just play video games together? Do more fun. We can't do mini golf together. So like, or whatever I would normally do, like we're at CES, let's go ride go-karts or drive tanks or something. Let's play video games together. And I started with a couple of friends, and clients, we started experimenting. And one of my favorite client meetings I've ever had, I have this distinct memory where my client and I were like, we're going to ride across the map in Red Dead. And we're riding and it's awesome. And I start doing the sales talk about like, hey, we should work on this together. What are we going to do? And out of nowhere, a cougar comes out of the bushes and knocks me off my horse. I spin around, shoot my client in the face, game over.
Very dramatic.
And but the thing is so like when I see this person and I talk to this person now, that is my memory of that client.
Yeah.
And that is real and that is visceral. And it's something we reminisce on in the same way we would reminisce if we go to a barbecue together. And that's important. And when brands and companies start thinking about going into the metaverse and engaging in these spaces, think about making something that is actually meaningful and matters. Don't just smack a logo on.
It's interesting because we built Complex Land, which was Complex Con's solution to a non-physical world we were living in. And this weekend we're going to Complex Land, which is the physical iteration of it. And I keep calling it Complex Land, and people keep reminding me that you're going into the physical world, which I'm excited about. But we've been thinking about how do the two converge in a valuable, interesting, badass kind of way, right? Where you're paying respect to the physical senses, but also enabling people to connect in a fun and really, really cool way in the digital space, which is a nice kind of segue in terms of what do we want? I would love your thoughts on, what does a near term, and I guess near term in this regard could be 5 years from now. What do we see as, I don't want to say a utopian, but maybe an idealized world for our clients where they've been able to harness the power of both while not forgetting the significance of each of them, right? Does that make sense?
It does. I think the thing to remember is that, and without throwing shade here, every time someone has tried to launch an Olorama experience, it's failed quite poorly. And so replicating every single physical sense without some sort of matrix style brain jack is not gonna be a thing, really. And like, that's okay. And
you're not feeling the neural net. You're not.
I mean, hey man, I would be the first person to get a chip. Like, let's go. If it makes my life easier, if it means I don't have to see ads or things for things I don't like, let's go. And like, hey man, if I walk in a room and the lights set off to the right temperatures, my monitor, whatever, like, I'm for that. But at the same time, so we're about to hit the trough disillusionment. If everybody follows the sort of chart of how things go, where it's always, I can't remember where we're at right now, but then there's like the valley of despair and then the trough of disillusionment and all these pretty heavy sort of like Tolkien-esque names for where people's expectations drop.
Mm-hmm.
We're about to go into that space.
Mm-hmm.
Now, what will happen is as things become more real and as things engage, it will improve and it will naturally get to a place where it becomes more intuitive. I don't know if anybody remembers like the first cell phones and how garbage those were, and now they're an inherent part of our lives. And we start seeing the virtual merge with the physical, and it'll initially kick off in the B2B space. You look at very distinctly, you look at where things get really interesting is with the plumbing of the metaverse, which is being built as we speak right now.
Yeah.
You start looking at, so NVIDIA are speaking about that heavily right now. All these sort of things require massive amounts of purpose-built, dedicated compute to really grow out. That's on its way, and that's happening. And as that builds up, and as our sort of B2B spaces get larger and larger, you very distinctly will see it grow, and it'll get better. I mean, I remember playing GoldenEye and N64 and thinking it was the coolest graphics in the entire world. and then I play it today and I'm like, really? That's what I thought was cool?
Spoiled rotten we are.
It'll change.
Yeah. That's a good opener for what skills do people need to be acquiring, right? I mean, from like, I would say integration architects, across platforms to intermediary managers or, game builders. And, with your background in games and deep knowledge there, a lot of the roles are active and alive in the gaming space, but are converging. If you could pick a few that you think would be key for brands as they're either looking to skill up their agencies or their internal team as well, what would your thoughts be on that?
I think lean into anything that feels native. So lean into gaming technology. You need to have solutions architects as part of your teams. Lean into people that are subject matter experts and are rich experts in all these sort of backgrounds. Learn engines. Figure out how engines work as part of your strategy. Learn about gaming, because again, one of the things is as this massive demographic shift occurs, you get to a space very, very quickly where some of these other demographics, unfortunately, the demographics for heart disease line up with some of these other demographics. So your audiences are literally dying and changing. Look at, I think from a basic practical level, you're going to need solution systems designers. You're going to need people who design these complex architectures. Cloud will become more and more important as every aspect of your life. You look at Amazon. The CEO of Amazon is now Andy Jassy. That's huge. That means so much. You look at, you start looking at how telecoms.
Can you expand on that? Just why that's so significant?
So Andy Jassy was the CEO of AWS. So AWS is a massive cloud compute provider.
Yep.
And when you look at the fact that Jeff Bezos, instead of replacing himself with a retail chief or somebody from another space, replaced himself with the head of AWS. That matters. That's huge, and that creates a transformative shift throughout the industry and throughout our worlds. I think that's where you start looking at cloud as well. Start looking at how you engage in games overall, and then also start looking at where social will shift into these spaces, and dialectically how to engage in a meaningful way with social.
Would you happen to have an example perhaps of, I'm going to make an assumption that Discord might be one of, the top contenders in that regard in terms of just how they're positioned? Anything that you think is pretty cool that Discord's been doing to kind of tap into that?
So, I mean, again, looking at Discord as a space, as a separate communicative space, and as a way that people can connect, which is new and somewhat outside of the norm, which is what really fascinates me. I think the other really major aspect, and I didn't hit on this earlier, if you look at a company, so HP, compute company, HP purchased Teradici earlier this year. Teradici is an appliance that connects to the cloud. That says a lot about the shift in physical, and that says a lot about how our world is virtualizing, because in order to get to this metaverse space, we're going to need to build the foundation. That foundation is built out of compute and GPU. It's built in a large foundational way from that.
Got it. Yeah. So we've got, the gaming world and the tech world and the IT world are converging. I mean, they're kind of the bells of the ball now as our engineers. I mean, they're as much as the creator community, which also is something to note, for example, like Tribeca in New York is doing Unity storytelling workshops, right? So they're actually bringing traditional filmmakers into Unity to understand. So there's this beautiful convergence, right, of game designers coming in and then filmmakers coming in, and like in Anaritu, who's a filmmaker who did this, one of the most beautifully immersive VR experiences that was multisensory and almost was like a beta. Piece. Exactly. Yeah. It's a beautiful piece. We can share a link to it afterwards. The creators that are really doing amazing work understand how important the technologists are and the developers and and integration specialists, which when you get a good example, like the Inaritu piece, it's absolutely transcendent, right? Where, the Void was another example where I remember when I put this maybe 4 or 5 years ago, I put on the Ghostbusters VR experience where they did it right, fully immersive. And one of the heads of the Void, he designed physically. So they actually designed the experience physically before they went in and did the game design. And I pulled the headset off and went, this is a game changer. And they were using like fundamental filmmaking techniques, but then had these spectacular advanced techniques on the gaming side, which was really interesting to see. Have you seen anything like that?
I mean, I think one of the things, so the Ghostbusters piece, I've been multiple times and it's amazing and it is transformative, because you put on the headset and you're like, oh yeah, this is the promise of VR. Okay, cool. I get it now. And like, it's those sort of moments in life, you don't get too many of those where you sort of like, the last time, the other places I can compare this to, like, and this sounds so grandiose, but when I went to Petra a couple of years back, we're doing a VR experience with Coldplay there. And went to Petra, and you walk in and you're like, oh yeah, I get why this is a thing. Like, this is pretty incredible. This is rad. I totally get it. And putting on the Ghostbusters experience, while it's not the same as Petra, you sort of get like, yeah, I get why that happens, why this matters. And it's the same experience I had when playing Horizon Zero Dawn, and there's a moment in the game where you move into a new area, and it's the same level and it's the same emotional resonance as you move into those new spaces. I think one of the things you hit on as well, so I have a background in film and VFX. I was partnered with a guy called Doug Lyman for a couple of years. We actually got a Guinness record for the first narrative VR series. One of the things that's interesting as you move into these game worlds is how much more democratized they are. So much of the traditional film world is about the auteur. And because of the way games are built, it takes a village, a gigantic village all over the world to build these spaces. And as we've seen at Media.Monks, we're a 6,000 person company. I manage on a day-to-day basis upwards of 30 people, none of whom live in the same city as me, but we connect directly, whether it's through Discord, whether it's through Unity intercoms, whether it's through Slack, and all different ways to adapt to all different learning styles. It's truly a team effort. And that's something that will be really interesting as we start moving into these new spaces, the breakdown of single individuals as the sort of voice, and the teams becoming a larger voice, which is a big part where brands are starting to engage. Is you have to look at like the chorus rather than the solo.
Yeah. Not rock stars, but a rock band.
I mean, I'm in a weird place where like I grew up going to punk rock shows. So like, there are no rock stars for me. There are no heroes. Here's 3 chords. Now go start a band. And so much of this is like, go learn Unity, go learn Unreal. Now go make a video game.
Yeah.
And that's, if you're going to do something in this space, make something authentic, make something real. Don't just do it to do it. Do it because you want to engage it. There's so much stuff that, like, I mean, I work in advertising, and you see these commercials like, why did you do that? Nobody wants to watch that. And that's a problem.
Yeah, it better be funny. That's all I have to say. Funny ones always get me.
Or engaging.
Or engaging, true. There's a question that weaves very nicely into this in terms of cultural shifts and, kind of buckets nicely in with values is there are some pretty significant cultural shifts, and especially that heavily plays into the metaverse and the underlying themes of blockchain and Ethereum and NFTs and the environmental implications of that, and sustainability is a massive one, especially from a consumer perspective and driving decisions. And that's a question that was prompted just in terms of what brands should be looking out for. And we're this session isn't going into like it's necessarily all the design criteria that a brand should be focused on, but looking at a sustainable future as it relates to the work you're doing will be imperative, because some brands aren't doing that and consumers are actively not participating. And there's obviously some significant changes. Ethereum is working towards some carbon neutral stuff in 2022. So there's going to be some solutions for that. But have you seen, or do you have any thoughts on, also ways brands can navigate that piece to the puzzle to make sure they're responsibly designing, what the future is going to look like from that side?
I mean, that's a really tough thing. I mean, in order for us to overcome Moore's law, it probably is going to require some form of polymetallic mining. And the only way to get those sort of materials is to scrape the ocean floors, which has a horrible carbon footprint, but at the same time, so does strip mining. And there are people with PhDs who are discussing this that don't have MFAs that perhaps will determine those sort of factors. I think that the sort of the environmental impact of NFTs is really, really problematic. But the environmental impact of, and I don't mean to sound contrarian, and I'm not trying to say lesser of two evils either, but when you look at the environmental impact of cars, of gas, of all that sort of stuff, it's very much all real. But I think if you look at some of the offsets that can be had by us creating smaller worlds and ways to connect within these work from home paradigms and within these metaverse paradigms where you're inherently burning less, I think there is a real meaningful thing. I think one thing I love, and somebody touched on this earlier, is as we're building a lot of these places, we're getting out of the LA, New York, San Francisco, London paradigm, where it's all the same 5 white dudes who went to the same 5 white private schools. And we're starting to find new voices and new places for new voices to engage. And also, like, so I lead one of the disability groups within our company, and there's so many possibilities there with adapting and creating a level playing field for people to engage and interact on. I think when brands lean in, I think authenticity is what is going to come back every single time. And then awareness of how your footprint works. And there are ways to work with a lot of the providers I've mentioned to look at carbon offsets, to look at all those sort of things where you can be more conscious because you're dealing with electricity rather than oil in a lot of cases. I think in terms of the transformative shift as a cultural piece, I do see a potential future where, because of us being able to connect on a more level playing field, because the access becomes more democratic, I do see some really interesting cultural shifts going. I mean, I was kidding earlier, like, but the Ramones are one of my favorite bands, and they're 3 dudes from Queens that got together and play some of the greatest music in the world, and none of them can play their own instruments. And when you look at some of the amazing video games that are coming out, they're coming out from creators who are not native video game makers. And that's meaningful and that's important. I think as brands engage, looking at ways to tell stories in different ways and authentic ways is where I would lean. I love some of the work that the film festivals are doing, like Tribeca. Lauren Hammond is doing amazing work over there, reaching out to different communities. I think Unreal is doing incredible work with education and bringing people in. I mean, that's the thing that's crazy. Unreal's free. Like, just download it and watch a bunch of YouTube videos and learn. And that's incredible that opportunity is there.
Yeah. Lauren's a pretty rad human, and Liz Rosenthal as well. Casey Baltaz, she's leading immersive in games over there now, and that's actually a really interesting signal because Lauren used to take care of immersive, and Casey Baltaz was gaming, and they're now one happy family. So it's, interesting seeing that coming together as we're having this conversation. I heard an anecdote the other day about a young human who was not driving his car so he could buy NFTs. So he actually mentally,
Yeah.
he understood like the carbon impacts of both and decided not to drive his car. So he was trading one for the other, which to your point, I mean, it doesn't, make it right either way, but it's interesting that his mind is operating in that manner. So in that's another piece to the puzzle in terms of skilling up. So, there's obviously sustainability analysts. There's organizations like B Corp. So B Corp is a really Media.Monks is a B Corp, which is a really significant thing, especially for the agency world, because as an agency, there's many ways we can make a positive impact. And for those who don't know what a B Corp is, it's a certification where a company works with the B Corp organization to define what their triple or quadruple bottom line is. People, planet, profit is usually the average trifecta, but depending on your company's impacts and also how you decide to lean into the metaverse or the 3D internet or whichever term you want to use, I'm hoping that we break it up and maybe we have some more names for it other than just the metaverse.
But I think to your point there, so where I just moved from Brooklyn, 35% of Brooklyn residents don't have access to fast internet. And they're defining fast internet as 5x5, which I would not define. That's like airplane internet. And that's insane. If you can imagine being somebody in Bed-Stuy at the start of the pandemic when education and work from home is happening and you don't have access to the internet, how are you able to engage with commerce? How are you able to grow? And you start seeing there's Estonia added access to the internet to their Bill of Rights. And I think we'll start to see more of that. And I think that's one thing that brands can engage with and interact with. The telecoms are doing amazing work with building out rural broadband and broadband within our cities to provide people with access. I think apprentice programs are a huge part of that as well.
Yeah, it's interesting that even in highly dense areas like that, connectivity is still an issue. That's something that should be remedied, hopefully, in the near future. Kind of takeaways that we think would be valuable for our audience here. I mean, we kind of thought, testing was a good way to wrap things up. Are there things you think we should be focusing on in that regard, just testing and trying to understand where brands fit in the ecosystem?
There's a weird thing. So you got to imagine that it's essentially 1999. And if you don't have, it's 1999 and Woodstock just ended. That was terrible, but it's 1999. And if you don't have a metaverse strategy right now, you probably are in 1999 and you don't have an internet strategy. And that's how things are transforming. And the metaverse is this big, wide term that, like I said, encompasses everything from commerce virtualization and digital twinning, where you're taking, a BMW car that has a 3D rendering and taking that 3D rendering all the way through the pipeline into the factory, back out to commercials and back again so that we can respond in an intuitive manner. Like that, it's that, but it's also 3D avatars. It's also some of the amazing work that Facebook or Meta is doing. It's video games. It's all these new cultural moments that will be the next massive thing over the next 5 years. And if you don't have that strategy and you're not thinking about it now, you will be left behind. And you'll end up being like I don't know if you can name a major horse-drawn carriage company, because I can't. And that's sort of the world we're looking into.
I was on a penny farthing a couple weeks ago. If that's
there you go.
They're like death traps. For people who know, they're the giant bikes that have the giant wheel and then the little wee wheel, and you have to climb onto it. It's not easy.
I think that's the big takeaway. The other thing is just get your feet wet, get in, start learning, start engaging, start playing. There's a thing cognitively apply yourself to this space. If you say you're not a person who doesn't play video games, that's because you don't play video games. Spend an hour a day playing games. Spend an hour finding out what it means, engage with all that sort of stuff, talk to younger people and find out what's rad. All those sort of moments. But I think that your 3 takeaways are: this is happening. You're not going to stop it. It's not going to change. This is a natural evolution in economies as they shift from digital to virtual and move forward. You already see that with advertising and the way like traditional advertisers are being squeezed on the digital platforms based upon Apple's recent rulings. You look at that and how that all changes. That's one major aspect. I think the other part is start engaging, start creating stuff, find out what works, but don't just make something meaningless. Make something that provides value and meaning.
Yeah, something just to build on that really quickly is to look at land. And we talked about, it's just like buying a website like pets.com, superduper.com, whatever it is that could relate to your brand. Buying and holding on land is not a bad move right now because the costs are quite reasonable. And, as mentioned, the prices are going up. So even if it's land you don't leverage as a brand, you could potentially resell it as well. So that's a really strategic move. And do some really, intentional foresight work with your audiences and your organization in terms of what your vision as a brand is as it relates to the delineation between utility and surprise and wonder, right?
Yeah.
And the previous talk, the gentleman from Vans was amazing, and then he talked about novelty versus true, the varying scales of value, which is a really smart way to approach it. And don't be intimidated. Just like you said, pretend it's 1999 and all will be well.
Godzilla 1999 is amazing to that point.
Right, see, we're just gonna keep talking about 1999 things.
But I think you're totally right, and I think it's defining what novelty is, and the first to field and first mover advantage is really, really meaningful. This is also happening because of the circular firing squad that is big tech right now.
Yeah,
and it's finding a way out and finding a way into a new, greener space that is user driven and is honestly personalized to everybody.
Yeah. This was awesome. I'm not sure if we have any more time. I think we've run out of our time. Being conscious of that, I think we're wrapping up. So Thank you so much for your time. This was really great. I love learning more stuff from you every time we hang out.